And let's now turn our conversation to Australia. We'd like to have a conversation between a couple of friends of mine who also happen to be active leaders globally and locally in the issues that matter to quality education. PasiSahlberg is an educator and author with deep experience in education reform. He's currently Professor of Education Policy and Deputy Director of the Gonski Institute at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And he's been a strong voice against reliance on standardised tests, and especially recently in Australia. Angelo Gavrielatos is President of the New South Wales Teachers Federation and formerly many things, including EI's Global Response Project dealing with the commercialisation and privatisation of education. An anonymous source told a newspaper reporter earlier this year the government's very nervous about him. Perhaps, Angelo, you can start by telling us what they are nervous about.
Well, Susan, thank you very much for the introduction, and teacher colleagues around the world, happy World Teachers Day. It's great to be joining you on this incredible broadcast, broadcasting live from Sydney, Australia this morning. Before I go any further, can I please acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're meeting and the many various lands upon which this broadcast is being received. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. It is a privilege to be in studio this morning with a great friend of Education International, a great friend of teachers around the world, our friend PasiSahlberg. Pasi, happy World Teachers Day.
Thank you very much, Angelo. Happy World Teachers Day to you too. Thank you.
Pasi, what a year. 2020, who could have predicted the year that we've had? What are some of your initial observations?
Well, we obviously during a day like this, we hear a lot about the disruption and difficulties, but also I think I tend to kind of take the positive things, the sunny side of the thing. And one of them obviously is that so many parents, after these school closures and learning from home, they have realized not only how difficult it is to teach something to your own children, but how important the fact is that we have a thing called school and teachers there every day to taking care of our children.
It's interesting that you started with that dimension there, parents' perspectives towards teachers. In Australia, in New South Wales, there was a survey conducted of parents during the period of the intense period of remote learning, online learning. 99.7% of parents surveyed reported they were satisfied with the work of their child's teacher. 96.6% reported they felt supported by the schools. And in the same research, 91% of parents surveyed said they had a greater level of respect for teachers. Now, Pasi, you recently wrote a piece that has certainly resonated with teachers, not only here in Australia, but around the world, the piece which you called "In Teachers We Trust." Can you just unpack that?
Yeah, I think, Angela, the respect is definitely an important thing. And I think if there's anything good coming out of this crisis is that we are probably going to see more respect to the teachers and the teaching profession as well. But the next thing from that is trust. And that's what many education systems, many cultures have been missing when it comes to teaching and learning, that it's a even if we respect the teachers' work and think that it's an important thing, there's still a long way to go to trusting them as leaders. And today we are celebrating teachers, but we also particularly celebrating the leadership that teachers can and could show. And for me, this kind of a leap that we could now take because of this pandemic and everything that has arrived with that is to really trust more teachers and their professional judgment in terms of not just, what should we change, what the school should look like after this pandemic, but how this change happens. And it's, Angela, it's so easy to have these lists of things that what the new school should look like when the pandemic is over and we return back to so-called normal things. But it's much harder to understand how do we get from here to there. And that's why, what I'm trying to communicate in that little piece and in my work overall is to, trust more teachers in leading our way from here to this new future.
Let's come back to that issue of trust and unpack that a little bit further.
Sure.
But just on the question of respect, and we've heard from prime ministers, leaders, just leading into our segment here, where there was a lot said about respect for teachers, respect that has grown. Whether that's sustained or not beyond the COVID period remains to be seen, and we would certainly hope that it is sustained. But one thing that we need to say, and we need to be, whilst we accept all the positive comments from elected leaders, I think it's fair to say, though, that their attitude towards our teachers and leaders was not always what it should have been during the height of the pandemic. More often than not, teachers and principals were an afterthought with respect to announcements that went to what needed to be done in schools. Students were very much at the centre of the deliberations, right, as they should be, but teachers and principals were an afterthought. Politicians tend to forget that teachers and principals are also mums and dads, brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts, grandparents, equally concerned about the impact of the pandemic on themselves and their immediate family, but beyond that, stepping up, going over and above the call of duty to look after kids and providing educational continuity. Let's hope politicians have learnt something as well with respect for teachers.
Yeah, and I think that we have an opportunity to really do that, because, you know, many governments, certainly governments, different governments here and in my own country, Finland, and elsewhere, now when they have been managing and dealing with this very complex and complicated situation that has arrived with the pandemic, you know, the most of the governments, some more and better than others, have really relied on the best expertise and experts that they have, namely health and medical experts, you know, asking their opinion. What should we do? How can we, you know, protect the people here and make sure that the nations and countries can survive this? But we haven't always done that in education. It's a more common way to reform national education systems is to write a political program or ideological agenda and then implement that. And just ask teachers and schools to do what somebody else has decided to do. What we have, the opportunity we have now is to try to help these politicians and leaders that, you know, many of them come with good intentions, to treat teachers and the teaching profession in a similar ways by relying the best expertise and experts that often happens to be, by the way, within the teaching profession. It's not necessarily in the research institutions or universities where they, you know, the experts are there as well. But the teachers and the teaching profession has probably the most profound understanding and insight into how can we change the schools to the places that we need to see in the future.
It's interesting you say that, because in the last 3 or 4 or 5 months, every night when we switch on our televisions for the news, the main actor delivering the news and advice is a health expert. It's right, the chief medical officer. Right. They've become household names, these chief medical officers. So what you're saying and hoping for is that maybe this newfound respect lends itself to a newfound trust where teachers are at the centre as chief medical officers are at the centre of helping us manage with this pandemic. Yeah. Just on trust, what are some of the policy settings that you think we should be trusting teachers on?
Well, you know, one of them is that, of course, the policy leaders in here in Australia and in Finland and many other countries. I think that what they need to think harder now is that what do the new policies and the implementation of these new policies look like? You know, traditionally, as most people know, that, you know, it has been a kind of a very rapid design of the program, implementing that, and then realizing that, you know, things didn't work out as we thought. I think now what these policy consequences would be to, you know, rethink this how part of the future. How do we get from here to there? And this how change happens in education could include a kind of a strong component of trusting and relying on teachers, both leadership and expertise in doing things that really makes a difference in the schools. I think too often here in Australia we hear, and I certainly see that when I visit the schools, and talk to practitioners, is that they have a kind of a feeling that nobody listens to their opinion and expertise. Nobody's interested in what they have learned during often many years of experience in the school. And they often believe that they would have been able to contribute some knowledge and understanding in particularly this how to change the system, how the schools change, so that many of these reforms that we have seen here and many other countries would have been more successful.
Well, that's a very novel concept, isn't it? The teacher expert being at the heart of teacher education policy design and implementation.
Yeah, but that's
novel.
But that's what we've seen during these last 6, 7, 8 months, and it's not rocket science. It's just inviting, asking who are the best experts, who are the people here who could help us to understand how to change the thing, and then invite them to the room. That's not the rocket science.
So just on that policy development, design, implementation, Pasi, you coined the term GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement, describing that virus, that there's no irony in that, describing that virus, the pandemic that has taken control of the global education reform movement, as you describe it, imposing in many instances quite regressive policies. One of those regressive policies that is being felt around the world is standardized testing, national mass standardized testing. It's interesting that as a result of the pandemic and its effects in Australia, its impact in Australia, the national standardised testing program this year was suspended. It didn't happen. And Pasi, I'm shocked the sky hasn't fallen in.
Indeed.
And in fact, teachers may have just been using the time more effectively.
Yeah.
What are your observations on GERM, the national standardised testing? There's a big debate in Australia about NAPLAN. The profession is quite definite. It should go. It's got to go. It's an anachronism. What's your observation?
Yeah, Angelo, it's a great point here. And, I would say that we didn't need to have the COVID pandemic that has killed thousands of people for us to realize that the time of high-stake, ill-used, wrongly used standardized testing is far over. But now we have the opportunity to really look at, what's happening without those tests and what is the kind of alternative. I'm a little bit concerned about, looking at the conversations here in Australia and some other countries, that it's almost like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic when it comes to rethinking the standardized testing programs. Just having a little bit, testing a little bit different earlier or later, and having new items and subjects in the testing doesn't really make a difference. I think now is the time to really ask this thing, that do we need something like that? What happens if the standardized tests would be different, if the kids would be not tested every year and every child, using these tests that often drive teachers and kids to focus on this very narrow area? What would this standardized testing or student assessment look like after the crisis? And I think, here in Australia, we have all the opportunities to think outside of the box and come with much bolder ideas than what we have had now.
Similarly, we didn't need the pandemic to tell us about massive inequities in our schooling system. Certainly, though, the pandemic has put a spotlight and has exposed the inequities. In some cases, may have deepened inequities as well. You've studied this in terms of the inequities that became apparent with digital online learning, remote learning. What are your observations there?
Yeah, I think the first thing, Angelo, that most people probably hear when we talk about inequalities with this pandemic is the unequal access that students have and did have to technology and computers and all these platforms that they have been using. But there's a kind of a deeper understanding when it comes to equity in education, and I think what we are beginning to see right now is the kind of a fact that, again, we didn't need the pandemic for this, is that there are a number of students in our communities and countries and systems here and everywhere who need school much more than the others to be successful, to do what they need to do and they want to do in their lives. And when the access to the school is disrupted and they are asked to rely on the technology or alternative medium, that's where the damage will be done. And that's why I think, this understanding is the first of all, that the schools alone cannot fix these inequalities, that this is something that the governments and other policies and the other systems linked to education have to do. But we don't need this crisis to understand how unequal our education systems are. And you know this better than anybody else, that UNESCO, OECD, World Bank, all these major organizations, far before this crisis started earlier this year, came up with these appeals that we have a learning and education crisis, mostly because of these inequalities and inequities.
Yet we have governments that exacerbate those inequalities rather than implement policies aimed at ameliorating those inequalities.
Right, but I think it's good to have these conversations. It's a sad that we have the crisis and the pandemic, but it's good that now people are finally, taking, for example, these inequalities in education more seriously and asking these important questions, that what it is that we need to do. And these questions must be asked by many more people than just the education ministers and people in the cabinets and teachers in the schools and others. This is something that the economists and politicians across the board should sit down now and ask that what can we do if we really want to fix some of these inequalities,
and study,
certainly here.
And study the evidence.
Exactly, yeah.
Just on that, and our time is running out, there's another global emergency that we're dealing with. It's not only the COVID, there's another global emergency, and that's called the climate emergency. Australia in January of this year was ravaged. And of course, our thoughts are with our colleagues on the west coast of the United States, which is experiencing the consequences of the climate emergency. Your last thoughts and words on the climate emergency and what needs to be done.
Angelo, it's the same thing, that we didn't need the COVID pandemic to remind us of the emergency actually that we have in our nature and in our ecosystem here. I think if we can learn, take these lessons that come with the COVID and start to ask ourselves that, what are those other things that we brought into this COVID pandemic with us that we should have actually taken more seriously 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but we didn't do anything. And this global climate crisis is one of those things. So it may be that, the silver lining of this whole thing that we are going through in the end will be exactly this, that we realize that let's take a kind of a more closer look at some of those things that we have to address now. And climate change is certainly one of those things.
On that note, Pasi, I'd love to continue talking
Me too.
with you, but we're getting the wind up here. It's been an incredible year, 2020, a year like no other. And it's probably very hard for any of us to imagine a year that could be any worse than this. We certainly thank all of our teachers here in Australia and around the world for taking the lead. We thank and recognise and salute our students who have taken the lead in a way that adults have failed with respect to the climate emergency. And I know that teachers and students and the broader community will continue to strive to achieve the very best for every child in every community we serve in every country around the world. On that note, we say goodbye from Sydney, Australia, and I hand back over to Susan and David.
Thank you, teachers. Bye-bye.